Welcome to a quick review on operant conditioning. Please take note that this is not all of the information that will be covered on the test. If for some reason you missed the original lecture, please go back and compare this to what is in your textbook. There are topics that you will need to review outside of the content presented here. A discussion of operant conditioning always starts with a discussion of B.F. Skinner and Edward Thorndike. Remember, Thorndike wrote the law of effect, which was the basis that any behavior that is followed by a positive consequence is likely to increase. Any behavior followed by a negative consequence is likely to decrease. Here you see a conditioning chamber, or something else that's also known as a Skinner box, created by B.F. Skinner. Skinner wanted to control absolutely the environment in which its subjects were in, and also to be able to control when and how the subjects got reinforcements, and also at times punishments. Knowledge of what this conditioning chamber or Skinner box looks like will help you on the quiz. With operant conditioning, we are always talking about consequences. The consequence, whether it's good or bad, reinforcing or punishing, is often determined by the learner. Understanding what reinforcer versus punishment means is crucial to understanding this content. Reinforcer means anything that makes it more likely that the behavior should increase. Punishment, anything that makes it more likely that the behavior should decrease. So here you have a really kind of quick example. Skinner always said that most of these behaviors start off accidentally. So here you have a small baby and he shows a smile or a giggle. His father picks him up. The consequence of his smile or giggle is this reinforced act of being given love. So he then chooses to deliberately give a laugh or a smile with the hope that the consequence follows, that he'll get a hug or a pickup again from the parent. The father picking him up is something that is added to the scenario, making it a positive reinforcement. As long as that reinforcer is in place, the behavior should stay relatively strong and continue to increase. It is incredibly important that when you see the word reinforcer, you think increase in behavior, regardless of whether positive or negative is what comes before that word. If it's a reinforcer, the behavior, the target behavior, should increase. When we talk about a negative reinforcer, if you take away something that somebody doesn't like, something that they find adversive or painful or annoying, and it causes them to increase the behavior, their behavior has been reinforced. If you add something to a scenario and the person desires it, likes it, maybe even finds it rewarding, then you've given them positive reinforcement. But in either condition, if the behavior increases, that person has been reinforced. And again, like I have mentioned before, this is always determined by the learner. The teacher or the person providing the consequence really has to take into account how the learner feels about it. So an example of a positive reinforcement would be sticker charts in kindergarten and preschool classes. The kids go and put away all their toys, they get a sticker. Literally just the sticker itself might be rewarding to the child, or even just saying good job. Negative reinforcement, the best one, or one of the most accessible examples of this, that chime that goes off when you haven't put your seatbelt on in your car. It will turn off, that annoying sound will turn off once you fasten your seatbelt. And car designers actually intended this. The chime is annoying, it's persistent, you put your seatbelt on, it goes away, and eventually you start putting your seatbelt on quicker so you don't actually have to hear the chime at all. It increases the behavior so you can avoid the sound of the chime. Same response, different consequence. This is where this idea comes in that it does depend on the learner. So you have someone who loves to speak in class. They write a great paper and you ask them to come up and share it in front of the class. If they find this consequence rewarding, they love being in front of the class, they're going to increase the behavior. However, same consequence, different student. You put a student in front of the class who is shy or doesn't like having the spotlight shown on them, they may then start to write worse papers to ensure that they never get put in that situation again. So, as a teacher, I may assume that putting the spotlight on a student makes them feel rewarded, but it does depend on the student. If the student hates the spotlight, then they may shy away from doing the same level of work. If they love the spotlight, it may in fact increase the behavior. Another consequence. So we have two kids talking in class. Let's say the girl here in the blue shirt desperately hates the class that she's in and she wants to get kicked out. And she gets kicked out. She no longer has to be in the class that she hates. That means the next time she comes to class, chances are she's going to start talking again so she can get removed from class. It's not a punishment, even though we would typically consider that a punishment. She may find it rewarding. In fact, it might be more of a punishment for her to have to stay in the class. However, if she's a good student, or she hates being in trouble, or she desperately loves that class, getting kicked out could be a punishment, which means that when she comes into class, she may stop talking altogether. So it is whether the behavior increases or decreases. That's what will determine whether or not it's a reinforcer, increasing a behavior, or a punishment, decreasing a behavior. Here's another example of positive versus negative reinforcement. And again, if you look at the effect on the behavior, both of them are an increase. Increase studying in the future. With the positive reinforcement, it's to gain or to get something desirable. So the person studies and they make the dean's list. The consequence of making the dean's list increases their study in the future because they would like to make the dean's list again. Negative reinforcement. They study to avoid losing a scholarship. They keep their scholarship, they avoid the loss of the scholarship, so they increase their studying in the future to continue to avoid losing the scholarship. In both scenarios, you see an increase of behavior. It's just due to whatever scenario you're looking at, whether it is to gain something or to avoid something. The avoidance with an increase of behavior is a negative reinforcement. We're now going to talk about escape learning and in just a minute, avoidance learning. Both of these types of learning use operant conditioning. Avoidance learning will also bring back elements of classical conditioning. In escape learning, you're going to see a kind of extended version of that Skinner box. So if you look down at the very bottom, you see what's called a shuttle box. And it's set up like a Skinner box, but there's a wall or a partition in between two halves that the animal can move in or in between. In an escape situation, you have to experience something to actually escape from it. So if there's nothing experienced, you're not escaping anything. So you have to have some kind of adversive or negative event for you to escape from. That becomes important when you determine escape versus avoidance. So escape learning, the puppy is on the left-hand side of the box. A small electric kind of current goes through the floor. It's going to shock the puppy's paws just a little bit. The puppy would most likely in the first run through try to figure out where it can get out of that side of the box and into the safe side that's no longer electrified. Reset the example, put the puppy back in the left side, turn on the electric grid. The puppy will jump very quickly into the right side, and eventually you're going to find that the puppy won't take very long to escape the electrocution at all. It will jump immediately into the right side. It's a form of negative reinforcement. The puppy has learned to increase the behavior of going to the right side of the box to avoid the aversive effect of the electric shock on the left side. Avoidance learning is very similar to what you just saw, but this is where the small difference comes in. In avoidance learning, there might be a signal stimuli. There might be something that indicates that there's going to be a shock before the shock ever occurs. So the animal learns that it can in fact avoid the shock, never have to experience it. And so we would pair up something like a light or a tone prior to the shock being given. Eventually, the puppy or the animal will sit there and go, that tone precedes the shock. The shock means I should jump to the other side of the shuttle box. When I see the light or I hear the tone, I'm just going to jump over, and I avoid being shocked altogether. And this brings in elements of classical conditioning and operant conditioning together. Anytime that we talk about behavior modification, whether we're talking about humans or animals, we never go from no behavior to perfect behavior really just in one conditioning step. Often what we have to do is shape behaviors. Shaping requires something called successive approximations. In other words, as a behavior slowly moves closer to a desired response, you continue to reward those behaviors. A really good example of this is potty training with children. You never really just have a kid who one day stands up, pulls down their pants, goes to the bathroom, pulls up their pants, washes their hand, flushes, does everything they have to, and they do it perfectly the very first time. So you can reward that behavior and be done with it. It ends up being that you sit there and you slowly take it step by step by step, and you start to reward those behaviors as they happen, and eventually you get the full behavior. So this literally is from a box of pull-ups with Thomas the Tank Engine, and you see the different broken down steps necessary for toilet training behavior. And here it's a sticker chart, and so I can take down my pants by myself. Well, the kid would get a sticker every single time they were able to do that. And I sat on the potty for a little while. It's mine. You get another sticker for that. The entire idea is that as these behaviors move closer and closer to the desired behavior, the child continues to get reinforcement on those individual behaviors. We do this often with training animals. If you go to Busch Gardens and you watch any of their animal shows, they never get the animal to do the full behavior right away. We went and saw the wolves. The wolves hopped up on these, tree stumps and did amazing things. They don't get the animals to just do that. As the animal moves closer and closer to the tree stump, you would give it a reward. When it finally sits on the tree stump, you give it a reward. And then eventually when it does that entire behavior without any problems, you give it a reward. But always just gradually modifying and shaping the behavior until you get the desired one. Chaining is very similar to shaping, but instead of it being this kind of modification of the overall behavior until you get to the perfect behavior at the end, this is really more along the lines of taking a complex behavior, breaking it into its separate individual elements, and then literally linking those bits back together to form a full chained sequence. An example of this might be swimming. So most people who take their kids to swim lessons, first thing that the children have to do is they have to be able to float. So you'll work on that. And then a lot of swim instructors will put the kids on a kickboard and they work on their legs or they'll work on their arms. But they literally teach these as like almost separate behaviors. And then they ask the child to float, pull with their arms, kick with their legs, and bring this entire behavior back together into a single ultimate behavior. And again, they would reinforce the arm movements, they would reinforce the leg movements, they would reinforce the floating, but they would then link them all together to create the more complex behavior. In class, we'll do a shaping experiment to look at whether or not reinforcement or punishment yields quicker results. What you will find in the shaping experiment is that when we shape a behavior, we don't ever tell the person exactly what we want, but we tell them what they're doing right. And they will, within a minute or so, go from no idea about what they're supposed to do to usually figuring it out and doing it perfectly. The person who's getting punished only gets feedback about what they're not doing correct. They keep being told, no, that's not right, that's not right, that's not right. There's always a million wrong ways to do something. Very rarely is there more than one right way to do something. With that in mind, reinforcement and shaping often leads to quicker and more desired outcomes, where punishment stops a lot of behaviors but often leaves the learner very confused. There's also different versions of reinforcement. And when we talk about a primary versus a secondary reinforcer, we're not really talking about levels, but we're talking about ones that we would work for, and they do tend to differ. A primary reinforcer, when we say it's innately reinforcing, it's something that we need to survive. So food, water, warmth, anything like that would be a primary reinforcer. We will work for money. Money doesn't feed us, but money allows us to buy food, which is why we work for it. Money becomes a secondary reinforcer. You may have a kid who's earning gold stars. Gold stars don't mean anything, but it might mean that they get to trade that in for a candy or something else that they want. And so it's a secondary reinforcer, but really secondary reinforcers only have strength if they lead to a primary reinforcer. So another way of talking about a secondary reinforcer is something called a token reinforcer or a token economy. If you're working to get gold stars, or maybe you earn chips or even money, it's a secondary reinforcer, but you learn that you can cash it in for often a primary reinforcer. They've done this with other animals. Just a really quick example, monkeys or chimpanzees can be taught very quickly that if they earn poker chips, they can cash it in for food. So they will work to earn a token. They'll put the token into a machine, the machine dispenses food. It's a very simple and very quick learned experience for them, even though they have no value for something like tokens or money. They can quickly learn that the tokens lead to this primary reinforcer, so they start to value the secondary reinforcer. For reinforcers to work, they must be contingent upon the performance of the desired behavior. Essentially, all this means is that if you want a reinforcer to be strong, it must be paired up with the desired behavior, especially in a token economy. So this was something that was done in a mental hospital, and it doesn't add up to 24 hours because of the number of responses and the total number of hours with the desired behaviors expected from the patients. But that's really not what's most important in looking at this. When any of the behaviors, whether it was something like attending therapy sessions, making their bed, eating together in the cafeteria, when those behaviors were reinforced, those behaviors stayed high. But let's say the person was walking down the hall and they were given a token even when they didn't do any of these desired behaviors. The behaviors actually dropped off rather significantly and rather quickly because people realized that it didn't matter if they attended therapy or if they cleaned their room or if they ate lunch in the communal area, that there was a chance that they would get a token that would allow them to get the same rewards without having to do any of the behaviors that maybe they didn't want to do. And so all of those behaviors died off. The minute that the behaviors became or the rewards became literally contingent upon the performance of the behaviors, you see the behaviors go right back up to high rates of response. For reinforcement to work, it must be clearly tied to a desired behavior, and it has to be paired with it in some fashion that makes it predictable or consistent. That doesn't mean every single time, but it does mean that it has to be paired up with that specific behavior. In reinforcing behaviors, there's 5 different ways that you can reinforce a behavior, and each different way of reinforcement comes with its own benefits and its own drawbacks. The first schedule of reinforcement is what we're going to call continuous reinforcement. If you have a chance, click on the video. It'll take you to Skinner and how he explained it, but if not, just kind of follow through. If you were training your puppy and every time your puppy sat, you gave it a food treat, what you're going to find is that the puppy will learn to sit rather quickly. So continuous reinforcement is a one-to-one type thing. Every time the behavior occurs, the behavior is rewarded. Every time the behavior occurs, the behavior is rewarded. Learning happens rather quickly. But there is a problem. If you withhold the reward, if you withhold the reinforcement, strangely enough, the behavior will still continue. It will spike. But if that reinforcement does not come back with a trial or two, then extinction happens rapidly. In fact, the puppy will just ignore the sit command. So for continuous reinforcement, the benefit is that you get very quick learning, but you also have very quick extinction of a behavior. The next 4 types of reinforcement are what we're going to call partial reinforcement schedules, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And these partial reinforcement schedules either reinforce on what we'll call a ratio, which is a number of behavior schedule, or an interval, a time frame schedule. To get the learning to happen, it's a little bit longer, it's a little slower to acquire, but the good thing about partial reinforcement is that even though it may take a little more time to acquire the behavior, the extinction rate of the behaviors is much less. It's much harder to extinguish the behavior. There's more resistance to extinction. So here's number 2. We're going to start with ratio behaviors. So this talks about the number of behaviors before you get rewarded. We will have fixed and variable. In a fixed ratio situation, you have to do a certain or specific number of behaviors and then you get rewarded. So here I have you selling 4 ice cream cones and then you get $1. If this is how you are getting rewarded, if this is how you're earning your money, what you're going to find is that you are going to try to sell or get to 4 ice cream cones as quickly as possible. The nice thing about fixed ratio is that it's a specific number of responses. The faster you respond, the more rewards you will get. So if you can sell, 40 ice cream cones in 10 minutes, you're going to find that you earn $10. The faster you can sell, the quicker you can earn money. You can change the ratio. So this allows for a lot of variability. You could say for every 5 or for every 20, but it still has to be fixed. And it gives you a very high rate of responding. Sometimes we talk about this as working for piecework, where someone in a sweatshop might have to put together 20 pairs of shoes before they earn whatever that one fixed amount would be. And so they work through the creation of something rather quickly. If you're looking at the blue line here, you're seeing fixed ratio. You see that the responding is evenly distributed, so every 4 they're going to actually get their reinforcer, and it's actually one of the faster rates of responding. So the ratio responses tend to be rather quickly acquired. Now we're into variable ratio. So variable ratio means it's unpredictable. Now, variable ratio is a little bit harder to establish because you don't know when you're going to get rewarded. But because of that unknown, it's almost impossible to extinguish this behavior. So really good examples of ratio is sitting at a slot machine. It's not how long you sit at the slot machine, it's the number of times that you pull the lever. So if you're sitting at a slot machine and you pull the lever once, twice, 3 times, and on your 4th pull, you hit jackpot, you're going to sit there and probably feed some more money into another slot machine. The next time, it might be 24, 25, 26 times before you actually hit a jackpot. And you may go, all right, next time has to be quicker. And so you put more tokens in. You don't know when you're going to get rewarded, but you know if you continue to feed tokens in, at some point, you'll hit another jackpot. Same thing with fishing. Everyone knows that if you go out and fish, it's not how long you sit there, it's how many times you throw your line in the water. You have to keep casting, reeling in, and casting. And so you may start the day with catching a fish in the first 2 hours, and then you may catch one every 15 or 20 minutes, and then you may catch one every 2 minutes, and then you may go back to not catching one for like 3 hours. But you always sit there and think in the back of your head, if I cast the line out one more time, this might be the time I catch a fish. If I pull the lever on the slot machine one more time, that might be the time that I hit the jackpot. Because of that, this has a very fast rate of acquisition and a very, very high inability to extinguish. It's very hard to extinguish this because it might just be that one time, that next time that you do the behavior. So you have your variable ratio. You see that it has a really high rate of acquisition. You see that the time that you start getting the reinforcements, you're going to see that the behavior becomes more rapid. They're going to do it more quickly. They're going to try to get in as many trials as possible because they want to eventually get to the reward scenario. Really hard to extinguish, very quick to acquire. Then we get into interval. An interval has to do with the amount of time. So if you get rewarded after a fixed amount of time, it's going to be closer to that fixed interval, closer to that time period, that you'll see an increase or a greater frequency of the responses. When Skinner did this with pigeons, he had pigeons being fed after about a minute. So right around 55 seconds or so, the pigeons would start pecking the disc, which was the desired response, very, very quickly. And then once they got the reward, they would actually leave a gap where they were inactive for maybe about 40 seconds or so. They started to kind of internally time how long they had to have a break before they actually had to start responding. Now, strangely enough, you can kind of think about this with report cards. Not every student does this, but some students will take the first couple of weeks after a report card comes out and go, oh, this is that time where I can kind of coast. As it gets closer and closer to getting the report card or the end of a quarter, they start turning in more work, they start becoming more active, they start looking for more ways of reinforcement. Same thing with pay schedules. If you get paid every 2 weeks, maybe there's a bonus every 2 weeks, something like that, you may start to see an increase in productivity as you get closer to that reinforcement time. So fixed interval, if you kind of look at this one, it's the black line. Notice that it looks like there's little or no activity, and then all of a sudden it's a very quick spike, little or no activity and a spike. That behavior is that after the reinforcement, you know there's a certain period or a certain time allotment where there's definitely going to be no reinforcement, so behavior becomes inactive. The closer you get to the reinforcement period, you see a very quick acquisition of behavior. And the last one for interval is going to be variable interval. So there's always a fixed for each and a variable for each. So we had a fixed ratio, a variable ratio, fixed interval, variable interval. Interval means time. So variable interval reinforces a response after an unknown time frame. This is going to be slow but very steady responding, and this one is almost impossible to extinguish. So the best example of this would be a pop quiz. You don't know at what time you're going to have your knowledge checked. So your best call is to study every night and keep yourself sharp. Now, it's not the number of times that you study that determines a pop quiz, it's the time frame. So teachers who use pop quizzes effectively will give you a pop quiz on, say, a Tuesday, And maybe they'll do it again on a Thursday, and then you go, okay, it's a Tuesday, Thursday thing. And then maybe they do it again on a Friday, and you're like, okay, well, that doesn't fit a pattern. So it's Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. Well, if they did it on Friday, they can't do it on Monday. They do it on Monday, but then they don't do it again until the following Friday. By about this time, if you've missed a pop quiz or you guessed their pattern wrong, officially you've decided there is no reasonable pattern and you should just study every night. So you get this very steady responding of study every night because you don't know what day you're going to be checked, what day you're going to have this pop quiz. So here are all 4 of the different ways of responding graphed out. Ratio schedules tend to produce more rapid responding. So the fixed and the variable, just the fact that they're ratio, they tend to have more rapid responding. The variable schedules, whether it's a variable ratio or variable interval, they tend to have very steady responses. So the lines are a little bit straighter. Variable schedules also tend to be much more resistant to extinction. In other words, they're less likely to all of a sudden disappear due to missing a reinforcement because it's not set on a schedule, so you never know when it's going to happen. Fixed ratio, if after you've done a behavior 4 times and you didn't get paid and you did another 4 times and you didn't get paid, the next time you might just be like, forget it, I'm not getting reinforced. And for something like a fixed interval, you wait 2 weeks and you don't get paid, and then you wait another 2 weeks and you don't get paid, then you're not going to work for the next 2 weeks. You're done. So those, if you start to miss it, you'll still possibly increase the behavior with the hope of maybe getting the reinforcement. But if it's missed on that schedule, you'll probably just stop doing the behavior. For variable, whether it's ratio or interval, because you never know when the reinforcement's coming, it's always a safer bet to continue the behavior. Here's just another way of looking at it. If you want to read through these examples, just pause the video and read through them. When we're talking about reinforcement, there is a couple of things that are important. One, the size and how long you have to wait for it. So, basic rule, in operant conditioning, it's best when the delay is going to be short, so you receive the reinforcement really close to the desired behavior, and the reinforcement is large enough. So it has to be large enough for the person to find it desirable. So if I ask somebody, would you do something for $5 now or $20 2 months from now? You still have to do the behavior now. I'll just pay you 2 months from now. Often, $5 now is much more desirable than $20 2 months from now. Skinner did this exact same thing with pigeons, and he looked at time and delay. So the pigeons would have pecked or pushed a response bar, and they would have then been given a delayed reinforcement. The food would have been presented to them after a certain amount of time. What Skinner found is that when he got around to about 100 seconds, almost 2 minutes, just shy of 2 minutes, that was such a long gap between getting the food and the pecking or the pressing behavior that the animal was expected to do, that the animal no longer made a connection between the two. And so the reinforcer was not a strong reinforcer because the animal didn't know what behavior to tie the reinforcement into. But if the reinforcement was paired directly next to the pressing behavior, or even within maybe 10 or 15 seconds of it, the rate of responding stayed high. Last concept that we're going to get through, and in class we'll spend much more time kind of talking about this. Punishment is going to be anything that decreases a behavior. When we talk about punishment, there is still positive and negative punishment. Positive punishment is the addition of something to decrease the behavior, while negative punishment is the removal of something desired to decrease the behavior. But the entire concept is that it decreases a behavior. So positive punishment might be getting more chores. No one's going to sit there and say that more chores is a good thing, but it's the addition of more chores to decrease your behavior. Versus negative punishment, which is taking away your car so you can't come home late, that's taken away to decrease a behavior. 2 different versions of punishment. Severe punishment. Severe punishment is going to be intense, and it should have a long-term suppression. It should suppress a response for a long period. It doesn't eliminate a response, and that's really important with punishment. Punishment doesn't eliminate responses. It either suppresses or diminishes a response for a time period. Mild punishment or weak punishments, they're going to slow a response, but again, neither of these extinguish or eliminate responses. They just dampen them. There is something that we'll call regression towards the mean. Often people think punishment works because you have somebody who is behaving badly, they get punished, the behavior diminishes. And so in comparison to the previous behavior, they appear to be doing better, but what they don't show is more beneficial behaviors. So here's Joey, he hits and kicks his sister, he's severely punished. The next day, his behavior just on the averages should be better than his behavior the day before. And so people go, oh, the punishment's working. The only problem is he may not be doing those bad behaviors, but you don't necessarily see him doing what we consider pro-social behaviors. Maybe he's not helping his sister. Maybe he's not using his manners. He's just not doing the bad behaviors. So when we look at punishment, it does dampen responses, but it doesn't guide towards desired behaviors. So he's not better than what he was. He's just average. Here are some of the problems with punishment. Punished behavior is not forgotten. It's just suppressed. So when the punishment is no longer a threat, often the behavior returns. This is really interesting because you will find that kids won't do bad behaviors in front of maybe parents or teachers that can punish them. But if there's no threat of punishment, that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't do the bad behaviors elsewhere. We know, especially with physical punishment, it causes increased aggression, whether that is emotional or physical, but essentially it shows children that aggression or strength and anger can solve a problem. And so usually that's why aggressive delinquents usually come from maybe abusive or aggressive parents. It's a learned way to deal with problems. It can create fear. So again, with corporal punishment, being hit to be taught not to do a behavior, well, that's usually coming from someone larger or more powerful than you, and for children that can create or generate fear. Whether that's coming from a bully or from a parent or somebody, but we know for a fact, and there's 50 years of research to back this, that it can actually also cause fear and then generalize to more undesirable behaviors. They may start to fear the parent whenever they have a problem and not want to tell them. They may fear school because school is where the bully's at. They may develop something later that we'll talk about called learned helplessness, where they have just resigned themselves to not seek out help because it's not going to be forthcoming. It doesn't guide towards desired behavior. It tells you what not to do. Punishment doesn't tell you what to do. And it also teaches people how to avoid punishment. So often punishment teaches you how to become a better liar. You come home late and you get punished for it. And so you decide the next time you're not going to come home late and be honest. You're going to come home and construct a big lie about why you're late because you want to avoid the punishment. These are all things that can happen or be problematic with punishment. But here's the thing, punishment can be used effectively. So the next slide is when we're going to talk about that. So punishment can be effective if it's used in conjunction with reinforcement and if it's used wisely. So punish the behavior, not the person. The person isn't bad, the behavior was bad. And so that takes it out of the person starting to make evaluations of themselves and they start to evaluate the behavior instead. Punish immediately. So you guys will hear me tell plenty of stories about how when my kids do something, I don't do the wait until your father gets home or wait until there's no one around. I punish in the moment because it's the behavior that needs to be addressed, not the child. Use a severe enough punishment to eliminate the behavior. So that means that not every behavior needs the same punishment, and so you have to pick and choose what punishment is most appropriate. If you overpunish, if you make the punishment so severe that the child will never ever be able to make it up, or it's too extreme, then they may decide that the bad behavior is going to be something that they're just going to have to deal with because the punishment will never go away. Reinforce appropriate behaviors. This is where it becomes important that you actually have a dialogue with your kids, or if you're training your dog and you have to punish them, that you immediately after they pee on your floor, you take them outside and you reinforce that they should pee outside. It's the appropriate behavior. You want them to have a roadmap to what they should do. Duration and intensity should match the crime. You should not be punished for 5 weeks for maybe, I don't know, talking back to your parent. And again, this isn't to say that, parents can't decide that, but that might be a little extreme. That's kind of almost feeling like there's a life sentence. So maybe there should be a more appropriate matching what you did. Don't give mixed signals. So people who hit and then tell their kids not to hit, for a young child, that's a very confused message. And so you're hearing once that this person is allowed to hit you to teach you not to hit, and then therefore you shouldn't hit. Or when we have parents yelling and screaming at their kids, and then get upset when they yell and scream back. We do model and we do express behaviors that people will in fact follow. So try to kind of keep the behavior and the messages consistent. The punishment should be consistent. It shouldn't be excused one day as, oh, it's just kids being kids, and the next day be hugely punished. There should be predictability. The punishment should be explained, and often some of the most effective of punishments can be what we call omission training, ignoring the undesirable behavior while simultaneously rewarding the desired behavior. So literally omitting the bad while reinforcing the good. It doesn't always work, and this isn't always textbook, but this is guidelines. So that's your review. It's rather quick, I know, and it goes over kind of the highlights of the big topics. We'll spend more time in class discussing them, but again, this gives you an overview of things that you should know. You should still go back, check over your chapter in the textbook, look at Tolman and omission training, look at latent learning. There's a couple more topics that we need to talk about that you will be tested on, but as far as what you need to know specifically for your quiz and what you need to know for operant conditioning, this is a pretty good review.